Good evening and welcome to Colorado Decides, a joint production of Colorado Public Television, CBS 4, KOA News Radio, and the Colorado Sun. I'm your host, Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you very much for joining us. Joining me is Sean Boyd, political specialist with CBS 4 News, and political analyst Eric Sonderman. We kick off our general election season looking at the major amendments and initiatives on November's ballot. This debate will examine both sides of the proposed Amendment 73, a proposal that would raise education funding in Colorado through various tax increase mechanisms. Joining us for the next 30 minutes are, in support of the measure, Brett Miles, Executive Director of the Northeast BOCES, that's the Board of Cooperative Educational Services. Here opposing the measure, Luke Ragland, President of Ready, Colorado. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. We have limited time, so let's get started. Brett, I want to start with you with just a very basic description. If folks haven't heard of Amendment 73, give me a short, basic description of what it would do.
You bet. So Amendment 73 is to address what we believe has been a devastating consequence of the Great Recession and restoring funding for public education. It does so through three parts. An additional graduated income tax that starts on households above $150,000 a year on their state return, which the Legislative Council tells us will be about 92% of the state of Colorado not affected. There's a corporate tax increase, which changes the corporate tax rate and increases at 1.43%, and then 1.37%, and then there is property tax relief. So one of the goals from the very beginning was to give us an equitable, sustainable, adequate school funding source, but also take care of some of our Gallagher issues.
All right. And Luke, again, a brief explanation of why you and Ready, Colorado stand opposed to the measure.
You know, I always like to start with a point of agreement, and I think Brett and I both care deeply about education and are looking to improve our schools. But we're here opposed because I think this is a dramatic departure away from the Colorado way of doing things. It would be a 78% tax increase on the top bracket in Colorado. That's not a typo, 78% increase. It would put us with the 8th highest tax bracket in America, on par with states like New York and Vermont. For those reasons, I think that it's a little too extreme of a measure to improve education.
All right, Sean, why don't you start us off? We'll get into the nitty-gritty details, which there are plenty.
Yeah, well, playing off what Luke said, why should only the higher income earners and businesses pay for education, do you think?
Well, so we're talking about the corporations as well. And when we look at the tax impact overall, so your total income, property, and sales tax, the total tax bill that impacts somebody. Right now, our teachers in that income range of $30,000 to $50,000 are paying a higher percentage of their annual income to taxes in the state than that top 1%. Even with the passage of Amendment 73, which would increase the top 1% earners, those people above $500,000 a year, it's still going to take their total tax liability will be somewhere in that between 6.6 and 7.1%, where the teachers in our schools are paying over 8% of their annual income in state and local taxes. So one of the goals from the very beginning was to take care of our schools, but also take a look at leveling that playing field just a little bit in the total tax liability.
Luke, let me follow up with you. You know, Colorado is a wealthy state, our economy is strong, so why shouldn't we fund schools better? Why should we be middle of the pack nationwide?
Yeah, I mean, the National Education Association, the teachers union, puts us right at about 27th in per pupil expenditures, so right in the middle of the pack. The only thing I would quibble with Brett, or even maybe your question there, is that it's a tax only on some. I would actually argue that this is a tax that will be felt by pretty much every Colorado taxpayer, and there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, those new tax brackets don't adjust for inflation. And so they're set in stone. So as inflation naturally occurs over the next course of 10, 20, 30 years, more and more Coloradans are going to be automatically put in those higher tax brackets. And put simply, more and more Coloradans are going to have automatic tax increases for years to come. Second, there is a very complicated and tricky but important change to the residential property taxes, your property taxes on your home. While they're nominally lowering the taxes, they're actually not lowering them to the level that they would otherwise go. Left to itself, the rates would go from 7.2 to 6.1. This freezes them at 7.0. Net, call me old-fashioned. If more money's coming out of your pocket and going to the government, I would call that a tax increase. And so if you own a home in Colorado, you're going to see a tax increase.
Eric, let's get you chimed in here. Question for either Luke or Brett.
Thanks, Dominic. Let me ask one of each of you. We've been starting with Brett, so I'll start this one with Luke. You made clear in your opening, Luke, that the two of you are together and obviously supporting schools and recognizing that schools need funds. So if not Amendment 73, what's your suggestion?
You know, I think that the biggest problem I have with Amendment 73 is that it's not looking at the root cause of why schools are struggling. Why are certain rural schools having a tough time? It simply is trying to say, let's just throw more money at it and see what happens. I think there are several important causes. Number one, the school finance formula, the way that we fund our schools, is incredibly inequitable, and it creates massive disparities. I like to tell a story about my hometown of Southwest Colorado. Dolores, Colorado, it's in Montezuma County, small town. Just up the road is Telluride. Very different place. Dolores and Telluride, only about an hour drive away, but about 10,000 years apart in terms of lifestyle. The way Colorado school funding formula works, people in Dolores send their tax dollars up to Denver, and more of them get sent back down to Telluride. Amendment 73 does nothing to fix those problems. Until we fix those problems, investing in a broken system doesn't make much sense to me.
And Brett, for you, how do you come up with this $1.6 billion number? That's a big number, $1 billion with a B.
It is.
I flash back 5 or 6 years ago, I believe we had Amendment 66 on the ballot. That was at $950 million. That went down by a huge margin, almost 2 to 1. How did we go from $950 million to now an ask of $1.6 billion?
So $1.6 billion will take Colorado somewhere near that national average. So this isn't a Massachusetts money grab. This, you know, or the top. This is to get us in the hunt. 1.6 billion is a lot of money, no doubt. It would take 5 years of Amendment 73 money just to pay back the $7 billion that we've lost since the recession started in 2008. So really what we're talking about here is we're talking about recovery so that we're back to 2009 levels, and then about half that again. So right now we're sitting at just under a $700 million deficit for what schools should be funded underneath our statute and Constitution, and this would get that plus about half again. So it's a huge number, but when we put it in perspective, we're only just getting up back over what we used to have in 2009.
And if I can just follow up quickly before I turn it back over, given how badly this was defeated at the $950 million level, what leads you to think that you can add another 60% or something like that to the number and have voters embrace this?
Oh, I think that we've seen this through our unprecedented signature drive and the way that we were able to generate signatures from all over the state. People are more ready to talk about this than they were before. There were a lot of problems with Amendment 66, and including complicated ways for money to come out and be tracking it in special projects. What I like most about Amendment 73 is it's all going straight to the local district through its per pupil allocation, and local communities are going to decide the best way for that money to impact them. So I think there's some real substantial differences, and I think there's just a much larger awareness of the need than we had when we looked at Amendment 66. And we saw that when we were out gathering signatures.
Sean, let's do some pull-ups.
They do have local control right now. School boards take the money and they decide how to spend it right now. I want to ask you, though, the timing of this is interesting. I cover the state legislature. It just got done approving the largest increase in school funding in, I think, a decade. It's about $475 more per pupil. And the legislature has been increasing funding every year since the recession ended. How do you argue for this tax increase now? Because they've been putting money toward that negative factor, you know, that was built up during the recession.
And the negative factor still sits at nearly $700 million.
But they're paying it down with...
And over a 10-year period so far, and we're not that close. I think it's very clear when I'm in the Capitol, which I was in there frequently, talking to people, they don't believe you're going to solve the money with the solve the issue of adequacy and equity, really, without the additional funds. We hear that very clearly from legislators while we're there. And so we have to go out and do that ourselves, because that's the world that we live in. Our legislature can't fully take care of the problem with their constraints with Tabor and Gallagher.
And let me ask you, Luke, certainly the money that the legislature has given has not led to the teacher pay increases that people have called for. And full-day kindergarten, how do we get those sort of things without new funding? I mean, Colorado doesn't have full-day kindergarten, you know, a state as wealthy and educated as us.
Yeah, I think two things I would highlight. We have been increasing funding. As you mentioned, we've increased funding in Colorado every year since 2011. And it's been substantial. Last year, not only did we increase funding for population and inflation growth, but we put an extra $150 million on top of that. But I think it's important to ask, funding for funding's sake or funding for a specific purpose? Let's talk about teachers, for instance. If more funding were going to go in the hands of teachers, I think it might be a different conversation, but all the evidence that we have says that that's not what's going to happen. From 1992 to 2014, per pupil expenditures adjusted for inflation in Colorado have increased by 15%. During that same time period, using the same data set, adjusted for inflation, teacher salaries are down 11%. And what that tells me is clearly the system that we have in Colorado is not going to result in higher teacher salaries until we make structural changes.
Eric, questions for other of our representatives?
So many directions to go. I guess let me start with Brett. Are there accountability measurements and accountability protections, I will say, built into this thing? Or is this really just a money issue? Or are there accountability protections and specific reforms to our education system that are built in here?
So just to be clear, so the question really, so we know that there's money that will flow through this, specifically targeting your gifted and talented population. So are you asking specifically, is there a new...
I guess what I'm asking is, how can voters be assured that if they dig deeper for another $1.6 billion, the product, the educational product, will be a better product as opposed to the same product?
Sure. I think they can be assured because the research is incredibly clear. Well-targeted dollars make a difference in student outcomes. And we've seen that over and over again when you can really target it. The thing that should give voters confidence...
And how does this target it?
And the thing that should give voters confidence is school boards all across the state right now are passing their own resolutions specifically saying where we're going to spend our money, where we need it. And it has to be different in each one of the districts because they're so different, not just rural, urban, but two rural neighbors right next to each other are very different and they're going to need it in different places. You know, a quick example for that is there's money coming through this amendment for our second language learners to address that need of second language learners. One school district may choose to address that need by lowering class size, and their next door neighbor may bring in additional English second language staff. The next school district right over might think that the best solution is curriculum materials or technology because of what they have in place. Everyone cut so differently over the last 10 years when things were going away that those local boards have to have the flexibility to build it back up based on what they need locally. If it comes in some sort of state mandate with an additional reporting, there goes your administrative costs, and some canned program that we have to put in from the department, it's not going to meet the needs of the local communities because they lost so differently during that time.
I'll just give you the same question, Luke. Do you believe that if this passes, obviously you're opposed, but if this passes, can Colorado look to an improved education system?
Absolutely not. Amendment 73 is not a good strategy to improve education. Brett is correct that well-targeted investments can improve educational outcomes. The research is clear on that. But that's not what Amendment 73 is. Amendment 73 is a blank check. There is no new accountability measures. And the research is also just as crystal clear that simply adding more money to education systems, simply just spending money on the same system, does not improve student results. Eric Hanishek from Stanford has done a meta-analysis. He looked at 163 studies that asked this question, and the vast majority showed that there were no improvements from simply adding money. I think that also is common sense, though. I don't know any of us who could imagine we simply spend more money for the same exact product and magically expect that product to be better. We have to make structural improvements.
Yeah, but I really have a hard time figuring out how it can't be, when we're talking about the exact same product. Most of the money in school districts are going towards teachers. So even in our smallest districts, it's 75% of your budget. In our largest districts, 90% of their budgets are going towards teachers. We can all agree that high quality teachers in every classroom is the best investment that you can possibly make. We have a dramatic teacher shortage. We can't produce enough teachers. If all of the teachers that graduate, young teachers graduate from our Colorado universities, take jobs in the state, we're still short of what we need. We've got to be able to bring in teachers to the state of Colorado, and Colorado has the lowest teacher competitive wage index in the entire nation. And so we're not going to grow enough of our own teachers. We've got to recruit teachers in, and teachers is a great investment. This money is going to end up with teachers because they're in the driver's seat. That's what we need.
You know, if I could just jump in really quick there, because I agree with Brett. He's identifying some real problems with teachers. But again, if we have all the available evidence that we have in Colorado currently, we can't expect that this money is going to end up in teachers' pockets. From 2011 to 2017, the number of students in Colorado has grown by 6%. The number of teachers in Colorado has grown by 8%. The number of administrators in Colorado has grown by 34%. When you add up the aggregate salary increases spent on administrators, and then you compare that to the aggregate salary increases spent on teachers, it's more than double the increase for administrators. We simply aren't investing and prioritizing teachers. That's the biggest problem with the teacher shortage in Colorado. It is not a matter of funding.
Brett, let me ask a question to follow up to the teacher point. 'Cause I think a lot of folks think about, okay, more teachers. It's easy to get agreement on that. But is there not another inherent problem in that a beginning teacher, fresh out of school, is not, there isn't any mechanism to suddenly give him or her much more of a raise because of how tenure and experience in a school is structured, that you're really able to make more money as a teacher once you're there for so long, not right out of the chute. Is there any way to address that with this funding?
I have no doubt whatsoever we will see base pay for teachers going up, because we know from talking with our universities that kids are going into the universities to become teachers, start to have that grown-up experience and starting to be able to calculate student loan debt, starting to calculate that $33,000 starting salary that they're going to end with, and then they choose not to continue and become a teacher. That's the key right there. And I think that when we look at those numbers, which I would love to dig through with you sometime, Luke, it's not what I see. We have over 140 of our 178 school districts are small rural school districts. I'll tell you, they're not growing in administration. They're all wearing more and more hats at the same time. And so it would be really interesting to tease that apart just a little bit more, because there's some hard things to look at those numbers when you talk about 80% of the students in a handful of metro districts, maybe some large districts, maybe not, but this is time for teachers, and we're ready.
Sean, let's get you back involved with more questions.
Luke, you keep coming back to accountability. You know, we're just throwing money at the problem, and there's not accountability built into this. Specifically, what kind of accountability factors would you like to see in this measure?
You know, I think one of the most important changes that we could make would be a transparency changes. We have made strides, and school districts have worked with the state to become more and more transparent about education funding. But I think you'll notice one thing as you talk to your neighbors or you listen to Brett and I, you're going to hear different numbers about how much we're spending on education. You can't find the final end-all how much we're spending on education in Colorado. The fact that we can't even identify the amount that we're spending, that's sort of step one for me. Step two, I think, is in terms of accountability, is making sure that parents have as much power and information over educational decisions as possible. And I think we've got a long ways to go in Colorado. Colorado's a very friendly state for parents, gives them a lot of choices and options, but I think we could do much better getting information into the hands of parents about the performance of their schools, ways that they can make a difference, and then ultimately which schools they can choose to attend.
So you're not talking about putting strings, attaching strings to this money?
No, it's almost the exact opposite, I think, is a lot of what we should be doing. We need to address the problems that are creating the situations that Brett describes. So the problems that Brett describes are real. What he's describing are real problems. But nothing in Amendment 73 looks at why those problems are occurring. It simply adds more money. A rural superintendent to me said, the house is on fire. And I said to him, well, why are we building an addition? I think it's time to address why the fire was started in the first place. And that's what Amendment 73 fails to do. I would love to work with Brett to find solutions to the actual problems. Amendment 73 is just simply pouring more fire or gasoline on the fire.
So, Brett, following up with what Lucas had to say, he's talked a lot about equity in school funding. How does this make school funding more equitable, specifically?
Specifically, the measure directly calls upon the legislature to put in a new School Finance Act with these additional dollars. And this last year during the legislature, Colorado superintendents came together and put together their own School Finance Act that addresses the equity issue. And it takes money to do that because it's a legislative process. We've all talked about this before. People have to vote yes and approve that. And to fix the inequities in our system for our most vulnerable students, for our smallest school districts that need those economies of scale, it takes additional dollars. It'll never happen in a legislative body of redistributing those existing dollars, because who's going to give up theirs when you're the big, powerful district to make sure that our poorest kids and our kids in our most remote locations have those same issues. So the amendment, quite rightly, calls specifically out adopt a new School Finance Act, and there's one that has the vast majority of superintendents ready to support as soon as the dollars are there to enact it.
Gentlemen, we're getting dangerously close to our closing statements. I'm going to ask Eric for a couple of short questions, and we'll get to our final statements. Eric?
I was going to ask about para, but that's the antithesis of short, so we'll save that for another day. Start with Brett. Basically a factual question. Does Amendment 73 require equal treatment and equal funding of charter schools?
So charter schools are public schools, and there are existing laws on the book about how schools have to work within their charter schools. So it will not change any of the existing law of how schools work with their charter schools.
Isn't there an opportunity that perhaps some might argue was missed here to require full equalization of funding?
I would say that most of the K-12 community would say that was addressed last year in the legislature.
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree with that a little bit in the sense that charters still have no access, typically, outside of a few rare examples, to facilities, and that they have to pay for facilities costs out of money that should be going to the classroom. Amendment 73 obviously does nothing to address that.
And if I have time for one more quick one, we'll start with Luke. So many school districts, particularly the rural ones, have moved to 4-day weeks. Does this, if this passes, does this address that issue, and is it the right way of addressing the 4-day week issue?
I don't believe it will address the issue, and a couple reasons for that. One, the cost savings for moving to a 4-day week are pretty nominal. Even the cost savings claimed are pretty slim, and then when people look at it in retrospect, it doesn't usually end up saving districts that much money. So I don't think that the 4-day school week is something that will change much. It's important to remember, too, that 105 of 178 school districts are single-site districts, meaning it's just one K-12 school there. And so when you hear these numbers, about 60% of the districts on a 4-day school week, it's a little bit misleading because it's a very small percentage of the number of students.
Maybe of the number of students, but I mean, we're talking now about Brighton, we're talking about Pueblo. I don't think you can make a reasonable argument that finance doesn't have a role in these really tough decisions that those communities had to face. I mean, we know there are 4-day school weeks that chose 4-day for another reason, but our recent examples are strictly driven by the amount of money available.
Well, half an hour goes by very quickly, as you just evidenced. We offer 1-minute closing statements to both our representatives. We flip a coin before the debate to determine the order. Brett, you're up first for your 1-minute closing statement.
All right, thank you. We're at a time right now when the state of Colorado has the strongest economy in the nation, yet we still owe a debt of $7 billion to our schools. Amendment 73 gives us a chance to correct that and address that. It gives us a chance to have more adequate funding, more equitable funding, and have a sustainable funding source moving forward by having those who have benefited the most from our booming economy pay more and still come close to the same percentage of income that our hardworking teachers are paying in their total tax bill. So Amendment 73 can help us by not creating some one-size-fits-all legislative approach. It puts the money in our hands of our local deciders, our communities, who are out there right now passing resolutions specifically saying what they need, how it will benefit. So we've had an unprecedented amount of support, a groundswell that we've seen during our historic petition drive. And there's a lot of enthusiasm out there that I think will carry over into yes votes on 73 in November.
Thank you very much, Brett. Luke, your turn for a 1-minute closing statement.
Thanks. You know, Coloradans have always had an independent streak. I think it's part of our Western heritage. We work together to solve problems, and we always keep an eye toward the future. The biggest problem with Amendment 73 is that it's a dramatic departure from the Colorado way of doing things. It would be one of the largest tax increases in our history, raising the top rate by 78%. Colorado would have the 8th highest tax bracket in the entire country. That puts us on par with states like New York and Vermont. Proponents claim that the tax will only impact some taxpayers, but the truth is that nearly every Colorado taxpayer will be hurt by this measure. Residential property taxes will increase on homeowners at a time when housing costs are skyrocketing. Colorado companies will have to raise prices on consumers and will be able to hire fewer employees. Worse yet, Amendment 73 is not a good strategy to improve education. Simply adding more money to the same inequitable system will only grow the bureaucracy, leaving teachers and students behind. Let's work together to improve education in the state of Colorado, but let's do it without destroying the Colorado way of life. Vote no on Amendment 73.
Gentlemen, thank you. That is all the time we have for our debate featuring both sides of the proposed Amendment 73 regarding education funding in Colorado. I'd like to thank our issue representatives, Brett Miles and Luke Ragland. I also like to thank my fellow panelists, Sean Boyd and Eric Sonderman. If you would like to find out more information about any of this year's general election issues and races, please visit our websites. It's a long list: cpt12.org, cbsdenver.com, koanewsradio.com, and coloradosun.com. Be sure to stay tuned as we kick off the fall season of our Both Sides of the Story high school debate series. You will not want to miss it. It will restore your faith in the future, trust me. For everyone here at Colorado Public Television, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you very much for watching. Good night.